Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Welcome to How Encryption Works, a webinar by LNG Security. My name is Natalie Adams, and I'm your moderator for today. Our presenter for the webinar is Sherry Davidoff. Sherry Davidoff is the CEO of LNG Security and author of Data Breaches. As a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data breach response, Sherry has been called a, quote, security badass by the New York Times. Her professional experiences are featured in the book Breaking and Entering, the extraordinary story of a hacker called Alien. Sherry is a GIAC certified forensic examiner and penetration tester, receiving her degree in computer science and electrical engineering from MIT. Her latest book, Ransomware and Cyber Extortion, will be published later this year. Sherry, at this time, I am passing you control of the webinar.
Thank you so much, Natalie. I really appreciate it. Always nice to see all of you out there. Today we're going to talk about not just how encryption works, but how cryptography works in general and all of the ways that it can help us protect our environments. However, cryptography is a double-edged sword. It is the technology that underlies things like the little lock icon when you surf the web, or Signal secure communications, VPNs. It also brings us ransomware and the dark web, neither of which could exist if it wasn't for cryptography. And today we'll talk a little bit about how all of these work. We'll start off by talking about why we need cryptography and how encryption works at a fundamental level. Then we'll dig into encryption at rest and encryption at transit. We're going to cover key concepts like public key encryption, also known as asymmetric key encryption, and demystify how that little lock icon works. We're also going to dig into one of my favorite topics, email encryption, one of the most underutilized technologies out there, and it has the potential to stop data breaches really from happening, because if the criminals can't break through that encryption, then they can actually get access to all the juicy information in your emails. At the end, we'll talk about how cryptocurrency works and also how losing your keys, your cryptographic keys, can help prevent you from gaining access to your Bitcoin. All right, but let's jump in. Why do we need cryptography? Well, first of all, cryptography can help us keep things confidential. That's probably the first thing we think about when we think about encryption. So it can help you lock up data on phones and computers. It can hide your passwords or your payment card numbers as they're in transit across the internet. It can help protect databases, even if your server gets hacked. The hackers may not have access to the data inside it if it's encrypted. We can also use it to keep our conversations private, something that's been evolving and maturing more and more over the past few years. And then again, criminals can use these technologies for evil as well. Let's dig into this a little more. So we use cryptography for authentication. That's when we verify someone's identity. If you get a phishing email that looks like it came from the CEO, you probably want to know, was that really from the CEO? Cryptography can help us understand who something really came from. We also use it for signing digital contracts, making sure that they haven't been modified, where we preserve the integrity of information. We can also use cryptography for authorization. So we use lots of different applications that act on our behalf every day, and we can authorize them using cryptography. We can also send money and digitally sign things using cryptography as well. So let's dig into the first piece of this, again, encryption and keeping things secret. So what is encryption? Encryption is the process of modifying information so it can only be understood by authorized parties. So on the left, I have Sam here. Sam wants to send a message to Alice. This is a secret. We're going to use encryption to scramble it so that nobody but Sam and Alice can read it. And then Alice will decrypt the message and recover the initial secret. How does this work? Well, at a fundamental level, encryption relies on an algorithm and a key. And only people who know the algorithm and have the key can unscramble the data. So what is an algorithm? Algorithm is a big fancy word, and for a long time in my life I was like, okay, what is an algorithm? People keep talking about it. It's really just a step-by-step procedure. So how are we going to change our data? An example of an algorithm is, we're going to take a number, add 12, multiply by 349, divide by 6, and take the remainder. That is my algorithm that I just made. And some algorithms work better for for scrambling information than others. Some of them you may be able to figure out what the code is, crack it, and reverse engineer it. Others, very, very difficult. So when we use this algorithm to encrypt data, you also want to use a key. And the key is just a long random string of numbers, a long random string of bits. And the longer it is, the more random it is, the harder it will be for someone to reverse engineer your information. So remember, our algorithm is that logical step-by-step procedure. Typically the key, that long weird number, will be part of that. And that's why you need to have the key in addition to the algorithm in order to figure out the secret. So this key, I got a question recently, what exactly is a key? A key is usually stored in a file on your computer or maybe on a thumb drive that you have. So again, it's just a long random string of numbers, usually stored in a file somewhere on your computer. Now, the reason this all works is because everything that we might want to encrypt is really just numbers, fundamentally, right? This picture, the cute picture of a puppy dog and a kitty, that is just numbers under the hood. I have a screenshot of that right there. So we can apply encryption and change all of the bits, all the numbers that make up that digital photograph and change it into something that can't be read. And then we can change it back when we want to read it if we know the proper algorithm and the key. So there's fundamentally two ways that we commonly see encryption being implemented. One is called symmetric key encryption. When we use symmetric key encryption, the same key encrypts data as will decrypt it. So we have one key, it can be used to lock up the data and also unlock the data. So there's an encryption algorithm that we use to scramble it, a decryption algorithm that we use to unscramble it, and that long random string of bits is what we use in both of those cases. So there's one key. That's the important thing to know. How can you tell if encryption is strong? This is another question I get all the time. Number one, key length. Longer keys are stronger. And when you think about it, that makes sense because they're harder to guess. If you have a key that's one letter, let's say, you've got a 1 out of 26 chance of guessing that key. So we like to see key lengths of 128 bits or 256 bits because they're really long. They're really hard to guess. Also, the more random they are, the harder it is for people to guess. If your key is just 11111 all the way across, somebody might be able to easily guess that. So the more random they are and the longer they are, the better. You also want to make sure you're using a strong algorithm, a strong process that's hard to reverse engineer. And typically you can just look these up. So if you Google AES, a modern encryption algorithm, you'll find some good information about its strength. And AES 256 with 256 bits is considered a very strong algorithm today. However, its older predecessor, DES, was broken long ago. It's easy to write a computer program to reverse engineer messages that are encrypted with DES. So if you have any questions, you can always go to a security professional who can advise you, or a cryptographer if it's really advanced. But a lot of these things you can just Google and you'll get some good information. Ideally, you want to have multiple layers of security, so you want to be keeping those keys in a secure place. That's really critical. These days, most of the time when encryption is broken, it's not actually the algorithm that's messed up. It's that the key was stolen or was somehow extracted or recovered. And we'll see that in a few minutes when we talk about the recent news involving Samsung phones. But first, let's go back in time and talk about where encryption and keys come from. During World War II, the Nazis used this Enigma machine. It was a machine designed to encode messages, and they would send their communications out by radio. So they were able to communicate in what they thought was a private way. Now, the messages they were sending were really critical for the war. They would send the positions of their boats, military information. And the way the Enigma worked was it was symmetric key encryption. So the sender and the receiver needed to have exactly the same configuration. Now, if you take a look at that machine, you'll notice there are 3 rotors on top, 3 wheels that can move. And they each have 26 settings. Those are used to change the key. There's over 159 quintillion possible key combinations. So it might sound impossible to figure out what that is, right? Wrong. This is why Alan Turing invented the bomb, his computer, for helping to decipher these communications. It was a huge technological advancement. It was right then at the birth of the computing industry, and this was one of the big drivers for it. If you've ever heard of key rotation, this is what they were doing. They were literally rotating those little rotors once or twice a day to change the keys, because the Nazis knew that it was possible for someone, or they presumed it was possible for someone to figure it out, someone to guess the key, and so they were constantly changing the key. But Alan Turing and the team of allies were able to figure out a reasonable way to regularly reverse engineer and figure out those keys. And they did this because they knew anytime they saw a message come out, it was likely to include information about the weather. They expected to hear the word weather right there in the initial part. And there were a few other keywords that they expected to hear that allowed them to calculate possible combinations of the rotors and then crack that as they were changing them. So really a critical contribution. All right, so let's talk about, Let's talk about encryption at rest. What are the places that we use encryption at rest? Well, we see it on desktops. So your desktop computer is likely encrypted these days. Laptops. Back in the early 2000s, we saw a lot of laptop thefts, USB drive thefts. There was the famous data breach involving the VA where a hard drive went missing and thousands of people's information was stolen. These days, encryption is ubiquitous on mobile devices. In fact, it's really one of the success stories in cybersecurity that we have seen devices so commonly encrypted. So for example, your Mac device will come automatically encrypted with File Vault. Your phones are typically have built-in encryption. How is this done? Typically, it's done with a symmetric key. Symmetric key encryption is very fast. It's faster than some other forms of encryption. However, you might be thinking to yourselves, how does this work? The key is stored locally on my computer, so if we're using symmetric key encryption, can't somebody just take the key off the computer and use it to decrypt it? It is possible. It depends on the implementation. These days, you've probably heard about a TPM chip, or a chip that is designed to have a key inside of it. And the trick here is that most of these are designed so that you can't actually get at the key itself. The key is built in with hardware, and it's designed to process information. You can't actually read the key. The key is just used to change information up. So that is one way that we see encryption implemented on these devices. There's other ways to do it. Of course, you can generate a key locally that's stored and used by software on the computer as well. Often we see, when we're doing device-based encryption, we see the key stored in what's called a key bag, and that gets encrypted too. So you have a symmetric key, the key is encrypted, and your password is used to unlock it. So there is a process with multiple levels of encryption. That is possible as well. Some common software that we use: BitLocker, File Vault, Veracrypt, and others. Now again, recently we saw in the news that Samsung had a fatal security flaw in over 100 million phones. This was patched in October 2021, but there are still many vulnerable phones out there. And researchers have demonstrated that they could extract the key from the phone, which means that it's trivial to decrypt the device. And so any information you have on that could potentially be accessed by an attacker if they had physical access to your phone. And phones get lost all the time, as do hard drives, which is why this is a problem. So again, key extraction is the challenge here. It's not like they're breaking the algorithm or that they have to build their own Turing machine to crack Enigma. No, they're just extracting the key out of the system. And once they figure out how to do that, they can easily write a tool for others to do it as well. We also get a lot of questions about encrypted documents. What if I put my sensitive information in a password-protected document? How secure is that? Well, unfortunately, the challenge with password-protected documents is twofold. Number one, the file is encrypted with a key, and the key is actually stored with the document itself. It is encrypted using a key that is derived from your password. So part of this, the security of the system, depends on the security of your password. If you pick a really long, good password, then it's going to be better than if you pick like Fluffy or ABC or something like that, something that is very easy to guess. So that's number one, because if I need to send someone a file, I would have to, the symmetric key encryption key would have to be sent along with that file, and it is. So my password is used to lock up the key, which is sent along with the file, and there's actually 2 layers of encryption there. Now, different types of programs will implement this differently. Microsoft Office documents are actually encrypted in a more straightforward way than Adobe PDFs, which are more complex, more difficult to reverse engineer. But the other problem with password protected files is that once you have a hold of them, you can have a computer try to guess the password billions and billions of times. And 99.9% of the time, you're going to be able to recover that password very quickly. I'll show you how this works. On the right-hand side, you can see LMG's first Uber Kraken. It's a cracking machine that we made years ago. And it was very souped up. It was actually built with graphics cards for processing because they're very, very fast. And at the time, we were able to try almost 10 billion passwords per second. So we use this specifically to crack passwords. What is password cracking? It's where you literally have a long, long list of passwords and you go through them and try each one. And now when you're trying to log in over the web, there are some limitations in how many times you can try to log in and how fast that login can happen. Maybe it'll lock me out after 3 attempts or 5 attempts, or there's always a time it takes to travel over the internet. I can't log in 10 billion times a second when my packets are traveling across the internet. But when I have a computer and the file is locally on my computer, there is nothing stopping me from going as fast as that computer's processor can go. So again, when you have a password protected file, if somebody gets a hold of that file, they will just use a fast computer to run through as many times as possible. We had a case not too long ago where a client, actually this has happened several times, where an IT person left a company and the company had a copy of an Excel spreadsheet which the IT person had used to store all of their passwords. And they needed to unlock it, but the Excel spreadsheet itself was password protected. What did they do? They sent it over here to LMG. We threw it in the Kraken. We had recovered that password within minutes, and they had access to the contents of their file. So you can see password cracking can be used for good, but again, it can also be used for evil. All right, so that's encryption at rest. Let's talk about encryption in transit. On the internet, your data goes through lots and lots of other computers. I always think it's funny when I get an email and at the bottom of the email there's a disclaimer that says the contents of this message and any attachments are confidential, because it's misleading. They're not. Sending an email across the internet is like sending information on a postcard. Same with text messages. You should assume that those messages can be read and are read, that they're copied, that anybody can see them. So even if you think the postman is not reading all of your letters, you probably wouldn't send lots of sensitive information on a postcard, right? There's lots of good reasons to not do that. Same thing on the internet. We want to make sure that we are putting our messages in an envelope, and that's what encryption can do for us. It helps us put those messages in an envelope, seal them up so that nobody can read them. All right, so encryption in transit is where we protect data as it is transferred across the network. One of the best ways to do this, or one of the technologies needed to do this, is asymmetric key encryption. So that's a very fancy way of saying we have a pair of keys. One key can lock data up and the other key unlocks it. That's it. It's also known as public key encryption, and what one key locks, the other key unlocks. So you can see in this diagram, I have a secret. I will use the encryption algorithm and the recipient's public key. I lock it up, and now nobody else can read it, and only the person with the private key can decrypt the message. Let's see how this works with a real-life analogy. I have a friend named Sam. Sam had a business in West Philadelphia, and Sam would often receive expensive packages. They would just get delivered to his front porch. And what happens when you get an expensive package delivered to your front porch in West Philly? It gets stolen. So Sam was tired of having all his packages stolen, and he built this really solid wooden box and screwed it down to his front porch. On the box, he put a padlock, and anybody could take the padlock off, put it back on. This is the equivalent of giving everybody a key to open that lock, right? So the lock gets opened. And then the UPS delivery person or the FedEx delivery person or whoever, they would come up with the expensive package. They would open the box and click the padlock shut so that who could open it? Nobody except Sam with his private key. So remember, Sam is the only one that has that private key. It's kept in his house. And if anyone else were to get a hold of it, they could open the box too. So really the security of that key is absolutely critical. If someone steals the key, they can then open the box. And that's it. That's the way it works. Again, if Alice wants to send Sam a secret message, Alice uses an encryption algorithm and Sam's public key. This is the key to lock things up just for Sam. And she scrambles that message. Now who can unlock it? Only Sam with his private key. And he has to keep that key very, very safe because if somebody gets a hold of it, they can decrypt his messages. So that's really the fundamentals of asymmetric key encryption. It is not as fast as symmetric key encryption, which is why we don't necessarily want to use it to encrypt a whole hard drive. But if you're trying to send someone a message across the internet, it is really crucial because you don't want to just be shouting your symmetric key across the internet at them. No, there needs to be a pair of keys. All right, unfortunately, encryption can be used for evil, and we see that with ransomware. Modern ransomware strains, such as REvil, typically use a combination of symmetric and asymmetric key encryption. So they use symmetric key encryption to encrypt all of the files as quickly as possible. Once you get infected with ransomware, symmetric key encryption will be used to encrypt everything on the local system, possibly things in your shared files on USBs. However, that symmetric key that's used by the malware can also be used to unlock the data, and that's not what the criminals want. Now, in the early days of ransomware, often they just left that symmetric key on your computer, and all these tools that could be used to bypass the encryption or to decrypt for free without paying a ransom, they were designed to recover that key from the system or from memory or wherever else it was living. However, the criminals got wise and they realized they needed to protect this symmetric key. So now what happens is most of these ransomware strains ship with a public-private key pair, and they may also generate a key pair on each system they infect. And here's an example with REvil. So each computer that gets infected, the malware will generate a public-private key pair. And the private key will be stored on the criminal system. The public key is actually listed in the ransom note. And you have to provide the criminal with the public key so that they can map that to the corresponding private key. And then if you pay the ransom, they will give you a utility that has the private key built in so you can decrypt your stuff. However, I've seen many cases where people will just remove the malware from the computer, including the ransom note. And the problem is, if you don't have the key that's in that ransom note, the criminals can't figure out which private key belongs to your computer, and you are toast. So really important to save each of those ransom notes, and particularly the key information that is located in them. We've also seen, and again, this varies depending on the variant and the different strains that will evolve over time. One strain that I thought was interesting was Dharma. We saw a Dharma strain that would actually encrypt different file shares with different keys. So you had to pay separately for your HR file share as opposed to your finance file share. And it did that by generating a different key pair for each share, locking them up, a different key, and then locking them up, and then you had to pay for each individual key separately. So again, back to some good news. All of these tools are very powerful, and just like other types of technology, they can be used for good or for evil. Let's talk about some of the other benefits of cryptography besides confidentiality. Digital signing is key. How do you know that a certain person took an action? Well, let's talk about key signing. Remember, we have with public key encryption a pair of keys, public and private, and they can be used not just for encrypting, but also for signing and verifying. So I can use my private key to sign a document, and everyone else can look up my corresponding public key and verify that it was me that signed the document. So remember, what one key signs, the other key verifies. As with encryption, that private key needs to stay secret. Let's go back to our real world analogy and understand why this works. Imagine that our box was locked and we come up to it later in the afternoon and we see that it was unlocked. Assuming that Sam's private key is still safe and secure, who could have taken this action? Well, only one person, only Sam, using his private key. So if you take some action using your private key, Other people can verify using the corresponding public key that it actually is open, the lock is open, everything looks correct, and it only could have been you that did it. So there's only one private key, and it's only Sam that could have opened this lock. Here's an example in the real world where we might want to use this. Let's say Alice tells Sam, who's her stockbroker in this case, I want you to purchase 300 shares of Microsoft. Well, how does Sam know that this is really coming from Alice and that she really means it? Alice can sign that message using a signature algorithm and her private key. So she takes the message, purchase 300 shares, and she takes a cryptographic hash, we'll get to that in a second, and she signs it. And then Sam can verify. Sam looks up her public key, which is just out there hosted on a key server. There's many different key servers out there where you can look up people's public keys. Sam uses the verification algorithm and can verify that she did in fact write the message, purchase 300 shares, it is correctly signed, and it hasn't been modified. So as long as Alice's key is in fact in her possession and nobody else has it, then only Alice could have sent that message. Okay, I mentioned a cryptographic checksum. Let's talk about that for a second because it's used a lot when it comes to digital signing. A cryptographic checksum, also known as a hash, is a mathematical algorithm applied to a piece of data. So we're going to take a piece of data and we're going to boil it down into this very short number of bits. You can see at the bottom a phrase which has been converted into a hash. So go Packers. I do some math on the bits that underlie that, and I come up with this long weird string, 6338C, blah, blah, blah. And it's always the same length. That's what the algorithm does. It spits out a certain string of bits that's always the same length, but should be unique to whatever it is that you're working on. If we change even one letter, if we make the uppercase to a lowercase, that hash is completely different. So even the tiniest little change means that the hash no longer matches. It shows us very clearly that the message has been changed. It's not the same as the original. And that becomes really important because, again, typically you'll take a message, you'll generate a hash of that message, and then cryptographically sign that hash. And the verification algorithm will do the same thing. It'll go through that message, generate the hash, and then verify that the signature is correct. And we know if that hash is any different, that they don't match and that the message has been changed or isn't correct. What are some of the benefits of digital signing? Authentication, we can verify that it was in fact Alice that sent that message. Integrity, maybe Alice sent the message, but a hacker changed the message to 400 shares instead of 300. We can verify that the message hasn't been changed. And non-repudiation. Alice can't come and say later, I didn't send that message, it was someone else. As long as her key is secure. So those are the benefits of digital signing. We are seeing digitally signed contracts more and more, and here's an example using Adobe Sign. So this is a contract that I've signed, and you can see that it has my name in it. Now, one question you might have is, okay, I've signed this with my private key, but how do people know that my private key belongs to Sherry Davidoff? The private key is a long string of numbers. How do we map that to my identity? That's where digital certificates come in. What is a digital certificate? Well, a digital certificate is just a file or a message that links identifying information like your name or your email address or your website to a specific key pair. And here's an example with Microsoft. If you go to Microsoft's website and you look up their certificate, you can see it says Microsoft.com, that belongs to Microsoft Corporation, and it's linked to Microsoft's public key. Well, how do we know we can trust this? There are third parties who will go and check and verify that a certain public key actually does belong to the person or organization that says they own that public key. In this case, it's Baltimore Cyber Trust Root. Baltimore Cyber Trust has gone and verified that this is in fact Microsoft. They have a process for doing that. They're mapping the public key to that owner, and they cryptographically sign this certificate. Your computer comes built in with public keys and certificates necessary for you to validate that signature. So that's one thing that a lot of people aren't aware of. Your computer actually ships. When you buy it, the web browser or the operating system have certificates built in, public certificates that allow you to verify signatures. And your browser will do that automatically, which we'll get to in a moment. Some of the really excellent benefits of the technology include being able to digitally sign emails. So this is an example of a message from me to my team. All of my emails are automatically cryptographically signed using a private key on my local computer. So my team knows if they get a message from me, it's going to be cryptographically signed. And if it's not, they can't trust this. Now that really comes in handy because of the number of phishing messages that people get pretending to be the CEO. If you want to know all the details, you can click on that digital signature right there, that little checkbox in your mail app, and you can actually see that whole certificate. You can see the date that it was created. You can see the email address associated with it. You can see my name. This is something that our mail client does automatically, and yours can too, although we don't often configure them that way. Okay. So here's an example of a phishing message that one of our team members got just a few weeks ago. It looks like it's coming from me. It says, "Hi there, hope all's well. Just touching base for a quick task." As I'm sure happens with many of your organizations, all the time these days, hackers are trying to get our staff members to buy a gift card or do some task for the CEO. And you can see that this message is not digitally signed. So everyone can tell that this is not really from me. It was not generated by my computer. It does not have that little checkbox, and they know to not trust it. That is a technology that could be more widely implemented, but really hasn't been yet. I think it's really the most underutilized tool in cybersecurity today. All right, so we can also use cryptography to help surf the web securely. And I want to talk through this whole process because your web browser is really smart about checking websites and making sure that the website is what you think it is and that all of your communications are secure. So let's take a peek under the hood and see how it's done. Let's see how this little lock icon works. The lock icon typically represents the use of SSL or TLS, Transport Layer Security, a protocol that is designed to enable you to authenticate, verify the identity of a web server and vice versa, and also encrypt your communications so they are confidential. This relies on both symmetric and asymmetric key encryption. So the first step is for your web browser to verify the identity of the web server. So how does this work? If you click on that lock icon, you will see a certificate. That tells you information about the owner of the website, who's operating it. In this case, it is wellsfargo.com. That is owned by Wells Fargo. And you can see that the certificate with that information has been signed by DigiCert. They're a very popular global certificate authority, and you have on your computer a public key that will verify that that signature is correct. So we know this is Wells Fargo. We can see that the little green checkbox that the certificate is valid. Another thing that your web browser checks automatically is that the certificate has not expired. So certificates don't last forever because it's possible for them to change over time. So every certificate has an expiration date in it. The third party that verifies the information will give it that expiration date. This is good until, let's say, June of 2022. Once it's past the expiration, it will not trust it anymore. And that makes sense because information often gets stolen these days. And so sooner or later, it's just designed with that expectation that we need to renew this information. And it also changes, of course. Information in these certificates will change over time. The other thing that it checks is whether or not the certificate has been revoked. So what happens if someone steals, let's say, Wells Fargo's private key? Or another vendor. We've seen this actually quite a bit recently. Attackers are going after private keys. What happens? Well, that certificate can be revoked, meaning you tell the whole world, hey, something happened. Sam's key got stolen. We're going to change the locks. Don't use that old lock anymore. Don't use that old key. So your web browser will automatically check and see if it's been revoked. Now, it's really important that you respond and notice any alerts that pop up, because when your web browser pops up an alert like this certificate is not valid, it's typically for an important reason, like the certificate's expired, or maybe it's been revoked, or maybe that signature isn't actually valid. And that's a sign to you that something fishy could be going on. All right, so once you verify that a website is what you think it is, this really is Wells Fargo, how do you make sure that your password and your other information is confidential in transit? Well, again, here's where we use a combination of symmetric and asymmetric key encryption. When we exchange information using SSL and TLS over the web, it is encrypted using a symmetric key, because we want to take advantage of the speed, the fact that it's really fast. In fact, there's going to be 2 session keys generated for the encryption. One is going to be from your computer to the web server, and then the other symmetric key is going to be for traffic from the web server back to you. So you have 2 session keys, and those will change over time. They get rotated. In fact, that should remind you of that Enigma machine where literally they were rotating keys. Something similar happens today when you surf the web. The keys get changed. We still refer to that as rotation. And that's because, again, it's possible, given enough time and data, to reverse engineer the keys if you have enough information. It's possible to do that, but if they change quickly enough, then an attacker would not have time to reverse engineer the keys. So again, you might be thinking to yourself, all right, well, if it's encrypted with a symmetric key, how do both ends of the conversation get a copy of that key? Aha! Well, turns out that we can use asymmetric key encryption for that. So if I want to send a secure message across the internet and I don't have any way to securely exchange the key otherwise, we can use asymmetric key encryption. And that's exactly what your computer does when you surf the web. Remember, we have a certificate presented to us by Wells Fargo. We have the public key already. We can use Wells Fargo's public key to lock up the information we want to send. In this case, a symmetric key. We send the symmetric key through the internet, and now both of us have a symmetric key. And the same thing works in the opposite direction. So key exchange happens using asymmetric or public key encryption. And then from that point on, we use symmetric keys, and they get rotated periodically so that an attacker can't guess the keys and start listening to our information. All right, so that's how the little lock icon works. Now, unfortunately, encryption in transit is not enough. There have been tons of data breaches over time that happen because information is just sitting on, say, a web server, and that web server gets hacked. And we saw an example of this last year when it came to the Excellion data breaches. Excellion was third-party file sharing software. It was designed to securely transfer sensitive files. And unfortunately, there was a vulnerability in this software. So criminals could exploit that vulnerability, break in, and steal all of that juicy, sensitive information. As a result of that, millions of people's information was stolen from law firms, from healthcare organizations, from universities, from retailers, from everyone. This was an international incident. However, it's possible to encrypt the data as it is sitting on those servers in the cloud. And if we were to do this, it could help protect us from many, many different kinds of data breaches. Another example of a cloud data breach that could be protected, that could be prevented through encryption, is business email compromise. Hackers break into your web-based email, often Office 365, and they go through those emails, grab the attachments, grab any sensitive information that they want. If those emails were encrypted, they would not be able to get access to the data unless they had the private key. So you may be thinking to yourself, I thought that the major vendors I work with have encryption at rest. And they do, sort of. So Microsoft is a great example. Microsoft OneDrive and SharePoint use BitLocker and have a unique key for each file. They use a very strong encryption algorithm, AES 256. And that means if a hacker were to break into that computer, they wouldn't be able to steal your information out of Microsoft OneDrive or SharePoint if they were just able to exploit and they didn't have the key. However, The key is somewhere on that server, right? We know this because when you go to log in, the application, your web application, automatically decrypts the files so you can see them. When you type in your password, you are able to browse your files. And that's what the criminals are doing. They're coming in the front door. They're using your password, and those files are automatically decrypted on the fly so that they can be read. So I hope that helps to clarify an important issue. Many of these cloud providers are using encryption. Your files are encrypted at rest, but that doesn't really help you if the web application decrypts it on the fly. It does mean if someone were to cart off that server and bring it somewhere else, they might have a hard time breaking into it. But someone can, again, walk in the front door and use the web application to decrypt your files. This is where end-to-end encryption comes in. End-to-end encryption is when you control the private key. So the key is actually on your computer, not in the cloud. And we see this used all the time in applications like Signal, for example, where if there's a third party, even if they are, let's say they work for Signal, the employees of Signal cannot eavesdrop on your conversation, even if they really want to. You have the only keys on your phone, and the recipient will have a key on their phone as well. So the downside of this is that you must keep track of your key. If you lose your key, you lose any data that's encrypted, that's been encrypted with it. There was a scandal towards the beginning of COVID involving Zoom and end-to-end encryption. Zoom had been advertising that they were using end-to-end encryption, and it came out that they were not. In fact, the keys were stored on the servers and not with the end users. And they ended up settling a lawsuit for $85 million because of this. But something good came out of this. They ended up rolling out actual end-to-end encryption. They were the first major video conferencing vendor to do this. I'm still so excited that this is widely available. And you can see right here, if you look for that little green shield icon, that means that end-to-end encryption is being used. Now, there are some limitations. Again, the keys are stored on your local system, so they are used to encrypt your conversations on the fly. Nobody in the middle could decrypt them. However, if someone tries to call in using a normal phone, it really won't work because the normal phone system does not support asymmetric key encryption. So everybody has to be calling in from their computer. There are some other limitations as well. There's always a trade-off between security and functionality. But the bottom line is now we have real end-to-end encryption in Zoom, and look for that little shield icon. All right, we've talked a couple times about email and encryption. One of the reasons it's so powerful and has enormous potential for security is because you can hold the keys on your system. And that means if somebody breaks into your webmail, they will just see a bunch of scrambled data. If someone were to break into my webmail, this is what they would see, because all of my internal messages are fully encrypted automatically, and they have been since the beginning of our company. Here's how it works. I want to show you that it does not take any energy from me on a regular basis to do this. So if I want to send Madison Eiler from our team an encrypted email, this actually happens automatically. My web browser will lock it up, and you can see that little lock icon right there. How does it do that? Well, my system has Madison's public key on it. We use GPG, and it's already in my GPG keychain. So the plugin to my mail will automatically encrypt any messages when I type Madison's name into the to line or the CC line of an email. It just automatically gets encrypted with her key, and it sends it off. And when she receives it, here's the message. She's prompted to type in her passphrase. She doesn't have to do this for every message. It caches it for a certain period of time. But typically, once in a while, we're prompted to enter that passphrase, and her email software will automatically unlock it. She can look at the message and see that it is in fact encrypted. There's the little lock icon and everything looks correct. There's a checkbox, everything's been signed. And again, if somebody breaks into her email or my email, they still can't see the contents of that message. If everybody were doing that, that would dramatically reduce the number of business email compromise cases that occur. So End-to-end encryption is used in email, and you may have heard of secure email where someone sends a link to your mailbox and you click on it and you go to a web portal and you type in a password. That is not true encrypted email. That's more like using a web portal. Real end-to-end encrypted email is sent directly to your inbox. It can be done very conveniently. The way it's done is with public-private key encryption. You have the recipient's public key. You use that to encrypt their messages. Only they can open it with their private key. You may have a passphrase too that's used in combination to help keep things more secure. For those of you that use Outlook, there is end-to-end encryption built in, and you can also use SMIME. So those are two very common ways that it's done. The SMIME integration is done using certificates to link the identity along with the public and private key pair. So you do need an IT professional to set it up. It is unfortunately not supported by all email clients, but it can work very well with Office 365. And then you can also use the native OME, Outlook Message Encryption. So this is available for users of Office 365 with E3 or higher subscriptions. It is a higher price. It works much more easily out of the box, but there is a 25 megabyte file size limit that comes along with it. For those of you that use Outlook, here's an example of the encrypt button that comes with it. So you can click that and choose exactly how you want to encrypt your message, or you can have it set up automatically. We often see third-party add-ons being used. So these might be a plugin to, let's say, your Chrome browser or your Firefox browser that can lock up your web-based emails. Again, we also have plugins like those for Mac Mail or Outlook that are third-party plugins. Often these are application-specific pieces of software. Some of them are free or low-cost. GPG Suite is a good example. The benefit of that is that it's free. Often this is actually very good quality software. However, there is less vetting. We saw this recently with Log4j. I'm a huge proponent of open source projects, but they typically don't have a whole team of security people going through and vetting the code. And so when you use an open source project, you should recognize that you may need to do your own vetting. And typically there's no extended support or things like that. All right, so we've seen throughout this presentation how important it is to keep keys and certificates safe, because if your key is stolen, your private key, then anybody can get access to your information, or anybody could digitally sign things on your behalf. And that has become more and more of a problem over the past few years. In fact, it just came up in the past few weeks when NVIDIA announced that their proprietary information was stolen and leaked by a cyber extortion group. Unfortunately, this included the private key used to sign their drivers, and many of us have computers that automatically trust NVIDIA's software because of those drivers. So your computer may be pre-configured to trust NVIDIA drivers because they are digitally signed using NVIDIA's private key. What we're seeing now is that the hackers are using those private keys to hide malware. So they're writing their own malware or purchasing it, cryptographically signing it with NVIDIA's key before they distribute it. That helps them evade antivirus. It can also help them evade endpoint detection, because this software like this is often whitelisted by these security products, and that means they're much harder to detect. We saw this in the example of SolarWinds. So in the case of SolarWinds, the hackers broke in, they installed the backdoor, and then they used the system within SolarWinds. They used their own private keys to digitally sign that software in the usual way before it was distributed to 18,000 customers. One of the big reasons why this malicious backdoor was not detected for months and months was because this was a correct digitally signed software package, and they trusted the SolarWinds key. So hackers know this. More and more they're going after private keys, they're going after those certificates, and they're going to use them to distribute their malware and remain undetected. So that's a big problem these days. All right. How do you store your keys? We need to keep our keys safe. Well, the method that you use to store them will depend on exactly where those keys are used, how many people use them, and what's an appropriate trade-off between risk and reward for you and your organization. I just wanted to mention a couple common systems that are used in the cloud. So if you have data or services up in the cloud, you may want to have encryption keys used but you want them to be convenient, easy to access, organized, and available to everyone who needs them. And that's where things like the Azure Key Vault comes in, or the AWS Key Management Service. These enable you to generate and store and use keys in the cloud in a way that is fairly secure. So take a look at that if you offer cloud services. If you have keys that you use personally or individually, you may want to actually store them not on your computer. Remember, a key is just a file typically stored on your computer, but you can, if you want, store it on something else. For example, the YubiKey, which we've talked about in the past during our authentication webinars, it can be used to generate and store public-private key pairs, or private keys used for like private symmetric keys as well. So take a peek at third-party hardware tokens, because that can be a very secure way to store your keys so that they're not always connected to your computer, and that limits the time that an attacker could potentially steal them. It is possible to keep keys too secure. Here's one example where a German programmer had an iron key, which is a thumb drive, and he had what at the time was the equivalent of $220 million worth of Bitcoin on that iron key. It was over 7,000 Bitcoin. However, the iron key will only give you a certain number of chances to guess the key before it self-destructs, and he forgot the password that he used. Last year, it came down to the wire. He only had 2 chances left to guess that key, and unfortunately, or to guess that password, and unfortunately, he guessed wrong, and he was not able to gain access to his millions and millions of dollars. So really sad story. You want to keep your keys secure, but there is such a thing as too secure. You definitely want to make sure to back up your private keys. So that gets us to cryptocurrency. You may be wondering, how exactly does cryptocurrency work? Well, it turns out that the technologies we've just discussed, in particular digital signing, are really fundamentally important to the blockchain and to how cryptocurrency works. A Bitcoin is not a coin. A Bitcoin is actually a chain of digital signatures. That is verbatim from the initial Bitcoin paper. How does this work? Well, it's just like your bank. Your bank actually probably doesn't have a vault with every dollar you have in it. Instead, they're keeping track of those transactions, and they keep them in a ledger. When it comes to Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies, we call this the blockchain, and it's just a ledger that anybody can have a copy of. That ledger is distributed down around the world. Now, if you want to send someone a Bitcoin, how do we do that? Well, turns out that we need to use our private key to send coins. So when you have Bitcoin, you control it using your private key. Wallets, when it comes to cryptocurrency, do not store coins. Wallets store your keys, your public-private key pair. So I'll give you an example. Let's say Alice wants to pay the plumber in Bitcoin, and the plumber's like, that's rad, I'll take your Bitcoin. So Alice actually writes a message that says, I want to pay $500 to the plumber, and she's going to use the plumber's public key to identify him. So she'll need to say, hey, tell me your public key. And then she will cryptographically sign a hash of that whole message with her private key. So that her private key is used so that we know she meant it, that this is really from her. The plumber's public key is used to identify him, and then the message that she writes tells us how much she is actually transferring to him. So all this relies on public-private keys, and she has to keep her private key very, very secret, or somebody else could send her money to another place, right? And here we go. The plumber sees, she sends that out to the blockchain. Anybody else can verify using her public key that this message is legitimate. And voila, the new transaction is added to the blockchain, and it is owned by, that Bitcoin is now owned by the plumber. That's how it works, public-private keys. Now again, if someone were to steal Alice's private key, they would control her Bitcoin. And conversely, if she were to lose her private key, she would lose access to her Bitcoin. We've seen this in action even recently with a number of recent hacks. One example is a hacker broke into the Vulkan forged gaming system. stole 96 different private keys and transferred $140 million in cryptocurrency out. So whoever controls those private keys controls the money, and you can't get it back. Once it's in a different wallet, it's controlled by a different key, which somebody else has. Another example, the couple that you see on the left here, they were responsible for laundering over $4.5 billion worth of Bitcoin. That's in today's dollars. And this all came from a hack of the Bitfinex exchange back around 2016, where criminals broke in and they were able to transfer millions of dollars worth of cryptocurrency to other wallets, where it then got transferred to other places and ultimately laundered. So whoever has access to the private keys has access to the cryptocurrency. All right, with that, we have covered a ton of ground today. We talked about encryption at rest. We talked about encryption in transit. You now know the difference between symmetric and asymmetric key encryption, and how all of us can use things like email encryption to keep ourselves and our organizations more safe. Some takeaways here: encryption has huge potential, but it's often not used, so ask for it and use it. Make sure you are keeping those keys and passwords safe. Back them up. Make them hard for criminals to steal. And pay attention to warnings. If you see a warning from your browser about an expired certificate or a certificate that's not trusted, definitely respond to that, because that's an alert that tells you that something fishy is going on. And with that, my name is Sherry Davidoff. I will turn it, you can drop me a line on LinkedIn if you want to connect or if you have any questions. I will turn it back over to Natalie to moderate our Q&A. Thank you so much.
Sherry, thank you so much. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them at this time. Let's start with this question. Do you have any tips on motivating users to take the extra steps to put encryption into place?
So this is a great question. I thank you for asking this one. I believe that the less work the user has to do, the better. So you saw when I went through my email, there's actually nothing that I personally have to do to encrypt a message. It is set up so it happens automatically and seamlessly, and if I forget to do it, that actually doesn't matter. It's still encrypted. That's just to my own internal team at LMG. Not everybody in the world, of course, supports encrypted email, so that would take more work. But the bottom line is, the less you have your users do, the better off everybody is. And then motivating, I think the more education we have, the better. When people understand the value of technology, then they're much more likely to use it, and you got to keep it top of mind. At LMG, we actually do managed on-demand awareness training using the KnowBe4 platform. So if you're interested, drop us a line. But that helps to keep cybersecurity top of mind for everyone in your organization.
That's great. Thank you, Sherry. Another question, a little off topic, but we'll go with it. Could you suggest a beginner guide to Bitcoin? A beginner's guide to Bitcoin. Yeah, so first of all, the initial Bitcoin paper is actually very good and pretty self-explanatory. So drop me a line on LinkedIn and I can send you a copy of that. There are also some good step-by-step guides as well that are just online on the web. So drop me a line on LinkedIn and I'll get you more information. But that initial paper by Satoshi Nakamoto is actually, pretty straightforward to follow. Great. Thanks, Sherry. Thank you to everyone who submitted questions as well. Once again, Sherry, I want to say thank you for today's presentation. My name is Natalie Adams with LMG Security, and we would like to thank everyone who attended. Thank you so much and have a great rest of your day.
Again, this is Sherry Davidoff, CEO of LMG Security. If you have any questions, please reach out anytime. We'd love to hear from you. You can email us at info@lmgsecurity.com or find us on LinkedIn and follow us on Twitter. Thanks so much for joining, and we'll see you next time.